Hi, I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. 9 days ago, a letter arrived at my house in Cleveland. Plain envelope. My name on it, handwritten. No return address on the outside, which I do not love, because I am 73 years old and I have been told about that sort of thing. I opened it standing at the counter. It was 2 pages, both sides, in handwriting that got smaller toward the bottom of each page, the way handwriting does when somebody has more to say than they planned. And by the second paragraph, I had to sit down. It was from a woman I have never met. She works for an organization in Ohio, not a large one. It is not a name you would know, and I am not going to say it, because I asked her on the telephone last Tuesday whether I could, and she said she would rather I did not. She was writing to say thank you. And she was writing to ask me a question, which was, how did we get chosen? Because that is the part nobody has explained. In July, when Taylor Swift and my son got married at Madison Square Garden, there was a piece of information that went out with all the rest of it. $26 million, donated to 20 national charities. You may remember it. It got a day of coverage. People wrote it up alongside the dress and the guest list, and the arcade games, and the sign outside that said Justin T. married. And then it went away, the way that kind of number does. Nobody followed it. Nobody asked which 20. And nobody, not one journalist, not one outlet, not one person in 11 weeks, asked the only question that actually matters, which is, how did they pick them? Here is the answer. They asked 20 people. 20 people, each connected to one of the two of them. Each asked for one name each. No committee, no foundation, no advisor with a spreadsheet of high-impact giving opportunities. 20 human beings, each asked, privately, in a phone call or across a table, give me the name of one place that matters to you. And then they gave $1.3 million to each of them. I was one of the 20. I got my call on the 8th of May 2026, at about 4 in the afternoon, standing in my house in Cleveland with a dish towel over my shoulder. And I want to tell you what I said, and how long it took me, and what happened afterward. Because I did not answer for 6 days. And when I finally did, I gave a name I have never said out loud to anybody in this family, including my own husband. So that is what this is. $26 million, 20 organizations, 20 phone calls, and 20 people who each had to sit down somewhere and decide what the single most important thing in their life had been. I am going to tell you as many of the 20 as I have permission to tell. I have permission for 11. Let me start with the mechanism, because the mechanism is the whole thing. Part 1. No gifts. You may remember that guests were told not to bring presents. George Kittle said it out loud afterward. The couple had told everybody, absolutely no gifts. It got reported and people thought it was a nice touch and moved on. It was not a nice touch. It was the first half of a plan. Here is how it started, as best as I can reconstruct it, and I have asked both of them about it separately. Sometime in the early spring, Travis says March, Taylor says late February, and I believe Taylor, they were doing the practical part of wedding planning, which is a great deal less romantic than people imagine, and they got to the registry. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. A wedding registry for those two people is an absurd document. There is nothing on this earth that either of them needs. There is no toaster, there is no set of towels. The entire concept collapses. Taylor said the conversation went something like this. She said, "What do we do about the registry?" And Travis said, "What registry?" And she said, "Exactly." She told me they sat with it for a while, and the obvious answer arrived quickly, which is, donations instead of gifts. That is not original. Plenty of people do it. It is a nice, sensible, slightly bloodless solution, and it is what a wedding planner would have suggested inside 4 minutes. And she said she almost went with it. She said, I had it. It was done. Donations in lieu of gifts. Pick a few good organizations. Put it on the website. Everybody feels fine. Then she said, and then Travis said something. I want to give you what he said, as accurately as I can, because both of them have given me the same version, which is how I know it is right. He said, who picks? And she said, what? And he said, who picks the places? And she said, I don't know, we do. Or somebody does. There'll be a list. And Travis said, so it's a list somebody makes. And she said, yes. And my son said, that's the boring version. She said she got slightly annoyed with him. She said, I said, it's $26 million, Travis. It's not boring. And she said he shrugged, which is a thing he does that infuriates everybody who loves him. And he said, the money's not boring, the list is boring. Then he said the thing. He said, everybody we know has a thing. Part 2. Everybody has a thing. That is the sentence. That is the sentence that turned $26 million from a line item into 20 separate human stories. And it came out of a 36-year-old tight end, sitting in a room with a laptop open, trying to avoid doing wedding admin. He said, everybody we know has a thing. He said, there's a place. Everybody's got one. There's some hospital or some program or some school or some little organization somewhere that did something for them at some point, and they think about it, and they never say anything about it, because who would you say it to? He said, ask them. She said she did not say anything for about 20 seconds. And then she said, how many? And he said, how many what? And she said, how many people do we ask? And Travis Kelce said, I don't know. 20? She told me this in June, weeks before the wedding, on the phone, and she said one thing about it that I have thought about ever since. She said, Donna, he does that. I said, does what? And she said, he says something completely obvious that nobody has thought of, and then he goes and gets a sandwich. She said, he didn't know he'd done anything. He genuinely did not know. He said it, and then he went into the other room, and I sat there for about 10 minutes. Then she said, it's the single most useful quality anybody I've ever worked with has had, and he doesn't know he has it. Part 3. The rules. She built the thing over the next 2 weeks, and she built it carefully. There were rules. She told me the rules when she called me, and I want to give them to you, because they are the reason it worked. Rule 1. One name each, not a list, one. She said, the second you let somebody give you 3, they give you the 3 that sound good. If they've only got 1, they have to give you the true one. Rule 2. No explanation required. You did not have to say why. You could simply give the name and hang up. She said, I was very clear about that with every single person. I said, you don't owe me a reason. Rule 3. Nobody finds out who else was asked. 20 people, and none of them knew the other 19. Some of them still do not. She said, because otherwise it becomes a competition, and people start picking things that will look good next to somebody else's. Rule 4. She would not tell the organizations who had named them. That one I did not understand at first. I asked her about it, and she said, because then the person who named them has to have a relationship with it. They have to be thanked. They have to be a benefactor. And that's not what this is. She said, I want somebody to be able to give a name and then never think about it again if that's what they need. And there was a 5th rule that she did not tell me until much later, and it is the one that got me. Rule 5. Travis did not get to see the list until it was finished. She said, he had the idea, he named one, and then I told him he wasn't allowed to know the other 19 until it was done. I said, why? And she said, because if he'd seen them coming in, he'd have started fixing them. She said, He'd have looked at somebody's name and thought, that one should be bigger, that one needs more, let me add to that one. He can't help it. She said, I wanted every single one to be worth exactly the same. Part 3.5. How it actually got done. I want to spend a few minutes on the machinery because I think people imagine that when somebody at that level decides to give away $26 million, they press a button. It was 3 months of work, and most of it was done by one woman, the woman with the notebooks. She has worked for Taylor since 2008. She is not a charitable advisor. She has no background in this whatsoever. She has spent 18 years in operations, which means her entire professional life has been about getting a person and a great deal of equipment from one place to another place on time. And in March of 2026, she was handed a piece of paper with a concept on it and told to make it work. I called her about it in August, after I found out about London, and we ended up talking for an hour and a half. I said, how hard was it? And she said, Donna, it was the hardest thing I have done in 18 years, and I have moved that woman through 9 countries in 11 days. She said the problem was not the money. She said, the money is easy. The money is a wire transfer. Anybody can send money. She said, the problem is that a small organization cannot receive $1.3 million on a Tuesday. I did not understand, and I said so. And she said, think about it. You run a place with 4 staff and an annual budget of $400,000. Somebody deposits 3 years of your operating budget in your account on a Tuesday with no warning. She said, half of them would have a governance crisis. Some of them would have a tax problem. A few of them have grant conditions that get complicated when your revenue suddenly triples, she said, and at least one of them would assume it was a scam and send it back. So they did it properly. Every single one of the 20 was contacted in advance, quietly, by a lawyer, not by anybody with a recognizable name. Every single one had a conversation about structure, whether it should come at once or over years, whether there were conditions, what it would do to their filings. Several of them are receiving it over 3 years because that is what their accountant said was correct. 2 of them, she told me, needed a board vote before they could accept it. One of them nearly turned it down. I stopped her there. I said, one of them nearly turned it down? And she said, yes. I said, which one? And she said, I'm not telling you. I said, why did they nearly turn it down? And she said, because they had a policy about anonymous gifts over a certain size, and they were worried about where it came from. She said, which honestly was the correct instinct, and I respected them enormously for it. I said, how did you resolve it? And she said, I got on a plane and went and sat in their office and explained it to 3 people for 2 hours. I said, you flew somewhere to convince an organization to accept $1.3 million. And she said, yes. And I said, how long did that take? And she said, the flight was 4 hours each way. Then she said something that I want to put in front of you, because it is the sort of thing nobody thinks about. She said, and none of them knew whose wedding it was. I said, what? And she said, not at first. For the first 2 months, none of the 20 organizations knew where the money was coming from. They were told it was a private donation being made in connection with a family event. She said, they found out on the 6th of July like everybody else. I said, why? And she said, because if you tell a small charity in March that Taylor Swift is going to give them $1.3 million in July, it does not stay secret until July. She said, not out of malice, out of joy. Somebody tells their spouse and their spouse tells somebody. She said, so we did the whole thing without telling them. I said, that's extraordinary. And she said, no, that's just the job. Then she said, the extraordinary part was the 20 phone calls, and she did every single one of those herself. I said, Taylor did? And she said, Every one, 20 calls. She would not delegate one of them. She said, I offered. I said I could make the initial contact and she could follow up. And she said, no. She said, because if somebody else asks the question, it's a survey. Part 4. My phone call, May 8th, 2026. A Friday. About 4 in the afternoon. I was in my kitchen. I had a dish towel over my shoulder. I remember that specifically because I still had it there 20 minutes later when the call ended, and I found it on my shoulder an hour after that, and did not remember putting it there. She said, Donna, I want to ask you something, and I want you to take your time with it. And I said, all right. And she said, if you could give a lot of money to one place, where would it go? I said, for what? And she said, for the wedding, instead of gifts. And I said, how much money? And Taylor Swift said, enough that it would change what they can do. She did not give me the number. She did not give any of the 20 the number. Nobody knew it was $1.3 million until afterward. She said, enough that it would change what they can do. That was the entire brief. And then she said, you don't have to tell me why, and you don't have to answer now. Take a week. And I said, I don't need a week. And she said, take a week. And I said, Taylor, I don't need. And she said, Donna, take the week. She was right and I was wrong. Because I had an answer immediately, and the answer I had immediately was the wrong one. Part 5. The answer I almost gave. I want to tell you what I nearly said in that first 30 seconds, because I think it is instructive, and because it is a little embarrassing. I nearly said the name of a very good, very large, very well-known organization that does very important work and that I have supported for a long time. I nearly said it because it was the correct answer. It was the answer a good person gives. It was defensible. Nobody would have raised an eyebrow. If it had ended up on a list next to 19 others, it would have looked completely at home. And Taylor said, take the week. And I have thought since that she knew. I think she knew that the first thing out of most people's mouths would be the respectable answer, and that is exactly why Rule 2 existed, no explanation required, and exactly why she made everybody wait. If you have to explain it, you pick something explicable. If you do not have to explain it, you have 6 days alone with the actual question. Part 6. 6 days. I did not sleep well that week, and I want to be honest about that. Not because it was distressing, because it was enormous. Somebody handed me a question that I had never in 73 years been asked, which is, what was the most important thing that ever happened to you, and who helped? And it turns out I did not know. I went through it in order. I thought about the hospital where both boys were born, which is a real answer and a good one, and I thought about it for about a day and then set it down, because the truth is that both births were straightforward and I was well cared for, and it was a Tuesday and a Wednesday, and nothing happened. I thought about Cleveland Heights High School, and about the athletic program, and about what that place gave those two boys. I thought about it hard. That is a real answer. And I set it down too, and I want to explain why, because it took me 2 days to work it out. I set it down because Ed and I gave that place as much as it gave us. We were in that building constantly. We drove, we fundraised, we sat on cold metal for a decade and a half. It was a partnership, and I do not owe it anything. And I realized, somewhere on day 3, that what I was looking for was not a place I loved. It was a place I owed. On day 4, I got to 1988. I have talked about 1988 in another one of these. I have told 2 people in 38 years, and then I told the entire internet about 3 weeks ago, which is a strange way to run a life, but here we are. Between Jason and Travis, there were 23 months, and in the spring of 1988, I was pregnant, and it did not go past 10 weeks. I have been very clear that it is not a wound anymore. It was for about a year, and then it was sad, and then it became a fact about a younger woman I used to be. I got to it on day 4, and I sat with it for about an hour, and then I set that down too. Because there was nowhere to send it. There was no organization. There was a doctor's office in Euclid, Ohio that closed in 1997. And then on day 5 I found it. And when I found it, I sat down on the floor of my own kitchen with my back against a cupboard, which is a thing I have now done twice this year at 73 years of age, and which I am beginning to think is a habit. Part 7. The name I gave. I called her on the 14th of May, and I said, "I've got it." And she said, "Okay." And I said the name. And there was a pause, and she said, "Can you spell it?" And I spelled it. It took a while, because it is a long name and there is a hyphen in it, and she wanted to be certain. And then she said, "Got it." And I said, "Don't you want to know why?" And Taylor Swift said, "No. I want to sit on that." I had spent 6 days preparing to explain myself. I had a version worked out. I had at one point written some of it down, which is not a thing I do. And she said no. And I said, "Are you sure?" And she said, "Donna, I meant it. You don't owe me a reason. If you want to tell me, tell me. If you don't, don't." I did not tell her. Not that day. I told her 11 weeks later, on August 14th, at my table, after she had told me something enormous of her own, because it did not seem right to let her be the only one. And I am going to tell you now, because a woman I have never met wrote me a letter 9 days ago and asked how they got chosen, and she deserves an answer, and this is the only way I have to give her one. Part 8. Why? In the autumn of 1974, when I was 21 years old, I worked for a short period in a place I am not going to describe in detail. It does not matter what it was. What matters is that I was very young, and I was in a situation that was not good, and it was not dramatic, and nobody was violent, and there is no story here that would interest anybody. It was simply a bad situation that I did not know how to get out of, and I did not have money, and I did not want to tell my parents. And there was a woman. She was, I think, about 40. She worked in an office in a building near where I was. I did not know her. I had spoken to her perhaps 4 times in my life, entirely about nothing. And one afternoon she stopped me and said, "Are you all right?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Come with me." She took me to a place. It was 2 rooms above a shop. It was run by 3 women, and it had no name that I ever knew, and I have never been able to establish whether it had any official existence at all. They gave me a cup of tea and a chair, and about 90 minutes and a piece of information that I did not have. That is it. That is the entire thing. 90 minutes and a piece of information. And it changed the next 18 months of my life completely, and if it had not happened, I do not know what would have. I never went back. I never learned any of their names. The woman who took me there, I saw her perhaps twice more and we never mentioned it, and I do not know what became of her, and I have never known her surname. I have thought about those 2 rooms approximately once a month for 52 years. Here is the problem. They do not exist. I have looked. I looked in 2003, when I first had a computer that could look, and I have looked half a dozen times since. 2 rooms above a shop in 1974, run by 3 women with no name. There is nothing to find. So, on the 5th day, in May of 2026, in my kitchen, with a dish towel on my shoulder, I found the closest thing that exists now. It is in Ohio. It is small. It does what those 3 women were doing in 2 rooms above a shop in 1974, except that it has a name and a phone number and a website and about 4 full-time staff. And in the spring of 2026 it was in trouble, which I knew because I have quietly sent them a check every year since 2009, and I read what they send back. That is the name I gave. Part 8 and a half, a little more, about 1974. I have been vague, and I want to be slightly less vague, because I think the vagueness is doing something I did not intend, which is making it sound worse than it was. Nobody hurt me. I want to say that plainly. Nothing was done to me. What happened was that I was 21 years old, and I had gone somewhere for work that was further from home than I had ever been, and the arrangement I had gone for turned out to be different from what I had been told, and I had signed something. That is it. That is the entire situation. I had signed something I did not understand, and it committed me to a period of time and an amount of money, and when I tried to leave, I was told I could not, and I believed them. I want to point at that phrase because I did not notice it until I was writing this out. I believed them. Not, I was trapped. Not, I was held. I believed them because I was 21 and I had signed a document, and I did not know that a document can be wrong. The woman who stopped me on that street asked if I was all right, and I said yes, and she took me up 2 flights of stairs anyway. And what those 3 women did in 90 minutes was this. One of them read it. That is the whole thing. One of them, a woman in her 50s in a cardigan, sat at a table and read a piece of paper I had signed 4 months earlier, and about 11 minutes into it she put it down and she said, "This isn't enforceable, love." She explained it to me for about 40 minutes. She explained what a document like that could and could not do. She explained which parts of it were real, and which parts were somebody hoping I would not know the difference. She explained what to say and to whom. And then she said, "Do you want me to come with you?" And I said no, because I was 21 and proud. And she said, "All right, come back if it doesn't go the way I've told you." It went exactly the way she had told me. It took 9 days and one difficult conversation, and then it was over, and I went home to Ohio. I never went back to those 2 rooms. I never learned any of their names. I saw the woman who took me there perhaps twice more, and we never mentioned it. 52 years. Now I want you to hear something. Go back about 10 minutes in this video to the part where I told you what Taylor picked. Hers is an organization that sits with young women who have been offered something and makes sure they understand what they are signing. She said, "Somebody in the room who's read it." I did not notice. I want to be extremely clear that I did not notice. I gave my name on May 14th. The list came out on July 6th. I read down it and found mine at 13 and sat on a hotel bed and did not look any further because I was crying. I did not put those 2 things next to each other until August 14th, at my own table, when I finally told her about 1974, and she said one sentence back to me, and I understood what I had been looking at for 6 weeks. She said, "Donna," and I said, "What?" And Taylor Swift said, "Mine is the same as yours." Neither of us knew. Rule 3. Nobody finds out who else was asked. Nobody compares. She picked hers in June, alone, without knowing anything about a 21-year-old in 1974, because of her own 30s and her own contracts and her own extremely public and extremely expensive education in what a document can do to a young woman who has not read it. And I picked mine in May, alone, because of 2 rooms above a shop, 52 years apart, 2 women who had never discussed any of it. The same organization, functionally, in 2 different states with 2 different names. Number 1 and number 13. She said, "It's alphabetical, Donna." I said, "I know it's alphabetical." And she said, "I know you know." And then neither of us said anything for a while. Part 9. What $1.3 million did not know the amount when I gave the name. I found out on July 6th, 3 days after the wedding, when the donation was announced and somebody sent me the list, and I saw it sitting there, that name, with the hyphen, 13th of 20. I sat down on a bed in a hotel in New York. $1.3 million. For an organization whose entire annual operating budget in 2025 was slightly under $400,000. The letter that arrived 9 days ago was from the woman who runs it. She wrote to say thank you. She also wrote, and this is the part that put me on a chair at my own counter. She wrote to describe what they have done with the first 11 weeks of it. She listed it, item by item. I am not going to read you the list. It is hers, and it involves specifics about a small organization in Ohio that I have no business publishing, but I will tell you the shape of it. They have hired 2 people. They have kept a thing open that was going to close in October. And they have, according to her letter, been able to say yes to a category of person they had been saying no to since 2019. She wrote, "We do not know who nominated us." She wrote, "We were told the donation came from the Swift-Kelce wedding and that the recipient list was chosen by people close to the couple and that the individual who put us forward has asked to remain anonymous." And then she wrote, "I have wondered every day since July who it was and why. I called her last Tuesday. I had her number because it was on the letter. I said, 'My name is Donna Kelce.' And she said, 'Yes.' And I said, 'I nominated you.' And there was a silence on that telephone that went on for long enough that I said her name to check she was still there. She said, 'Can I ask why?' And I said, 'Yes.' And I told her about 1974, and 2 rooms above a shop, and 3 women, whose names I never learned, and a woman of about 40, who stopped me on a street and said, 'Are you all right?' And she listened to all of it, and did not say anything. And when I finished, she said one sentence. She said, 'That's what we do.' And I said, 'I know. That's why.' Part 10, 19 others. I said at the top that I have permission for 11. That means 11 of the 20 people who were asked have said I may say something about their name. 9 have not, and several of those 9 I have not asked because I know the answer and it would be unkind to make them say it. I am going to give you 6. Jason. My eldest son was asked in the first week of May, the same week as me. He took 4 days. And he gave the name of a program in Philadelphia that works with children who have severe communication difficulties. If you know anything about Jason Kelce, you may already know why. He has talked publicly, more than once, about being born with a hearing impairment and about a childhood of speech difficulty that he worked out of over a period of years. He has never made a great deal of it. He has mentioned it and moved on. He told me on the phone, when he told me his name, months later. I couldn't say my R's until I was about 7, Mom. I said, "I remember, Jason." And he said, "I know you remember. You drove me." I asked Jason what 4 days of thinking about it was like. And he said, "Bad, honestly." He said, "I sat with it for 4 days and about halfway through I got annoyed." I said, "Annoyed at what?" And Jason said, "At the question." He said, "Because I realized about day 2 that I'd have given a different answer at 25, and a different one at 30, and a different one now, and that meant none of them were the real one." He said, "And then on day 3 I worked out that the reason I couldn't pick was that I was trying to pick the most important thing that ever happened to me." He said, "And that's not the question." I said, "What's the question?" And my eldest son said, "The question is, who helped when nobody had to?" He said, "Once I did it that way, it took about 4 minutes." He said, "Because there's a woman who drove me to speech therapy in Cleveland Heights for 2 years, and she was not paid to do it, and she was not my mother." I said, "Jason." And he said, "Mrs." And then he said a name I had not heard in 30 years, and which I am not going to print, because I have not been able to find out whether she is alive. He said, "She's not the charity. I couldn't find her, and I looked, so I gave the closest thing to what she did." Kylie. Kylie was asked separately, which I want to point out, because Taylor could have asked Jason and Kylie as a couple and counted them as one. She did not. They got two names. Kylie's name is a field hockey program, not a famous one, a regional one, for girls, in a place where the funding is not what it should be. She told me, I've got 4 daughters. That was the whole explanation. I've got 4 daughters. Ed. Now, I have been married to Ed Kelce for a very long time, and I would have told you before May of 2026 that there was nothing significant about that man that I did not know. Ed was asked on the 9th of May. He gave his name in about 4 hours, which is the fastest of the 20 by a margin of several days. And he did not tell me what it was. For 11 weeks. I found out on July 6th, same as everybody, when the list came out. I read down it and I got to number 4 and I stopped. It was a fund, a small one. It supports the families of high school coaches in a particular part of Ohio in the event of catastrophic illness. I said, Ed. And he said, And I said, Ed, what is that? And my husband, who is 70-something years old, and who says approximately 4 sentimental sentences per decade, said, 1982. And then he told me a story about a man I had never heard of who coached at a school 40 minutes from where we lived, who got sick, and whose family had nothing, and what a group of men in that county did about it over about 6 months. Ed was one of those men. He was 29 years old. He has never mentioned it, not once, in 44 years. I said, Why did you never tell me? And Ed Kelce said, It wasn't a story, it was just a thing we did. Andrea Swift. Taylor's mother. I know her name because Andrea told me herself, in August, on the telephone. It is an organization that works with people going through a specific and difficult category of illness. Andrea has been public about her own health. She has been through things and she does not hide them, and she also does not perform them. She said one thing to me about it, and I am going to give it to you exactly. She said, I picked the one that helped me on the worst day. She said, not the biggest one, not the best one, the one that answered the phone at 11 at night on the worst day. To Austin Swift. Taylor's brother, man of honor at the wedding, which got a great deal of attention. He gave the name of a small film program for teenagers. Austin has spent his working life in and around film. Taylor told me he took 9 days, the longest of the 20, and that when he finally called her, he said, This is going to sound self-indulgent. And she told him Rule 2, which is that he did not owe anybody a reason, and he gave the name and hung up. The woman with the notebooks. I have written about her in another one of these. She has worked for Taylor since 2008. She keeps notebooks going back 17 years. She is the person who, on August 14th, moved 4 things and lied to one person so that my son could stand on a London pavement at 10 to 6 in the morning. She was one of the 20. She gave the name of a legal aid organization that works with young people in entertainment. I asked her about it on the telephone, and she was quiet, and then she said, I was 23 once, and I did not have anybody. That is the entire explanation she gave, and I did not push. Andy Reid. I want to be careful here because I am telling you a thing about a man who does not do this. Andy Reid has coached professional football since before most of the people listening to this were born. He drafted Jason in Philadelphia in 2011, and he drafted Travis in Kansas City in 2013, and he is, in the private opinion of this entire family, one of the great men in the sport. He was one of the 20. He took 2 days, and he gave the name of a program that works with young men coming out of the prison system in Missouri. He has never said a word about it publicly, and he is not going to, and I have his permission for this paragraph and no more. I asked Travis whether he was surprised, and my son said no. He said, Mom, that man has hired more people out of nowhere than anybody I have ever met. He said, He does not talk about it. He just keeps having people around who nobody else would have taken. Brittany Mahomes. Brittany was asked, and Brittany gave a name in about a day. It is a maternal health organization. I am not going to say more than that, except to say that Brittany has been public about a difficult delivery, and that anybody who has been through that particular door knows exactly why she picked what she picked. She told me one thing on the telephone. She said, "I nearly picked something for the kids." I said, "Why didn't you?" And Brittany said, "Because I've got the kids covered. Nobody covers the mother." Selena Gomez. She has spoken publicly about her health for years, and she has spoken publicly about mental health for longer, so I am not revealing anything by telling you the category. The specific organization is small and regional, and she asked me not to name it. Taylor told me she took 6 days, same as me, and that when she called with the name, she said one sentence first. She said, "I want the small one." Taylor said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Everybody gives to the big one. I want the small one that does the actual work." Adam Sandler officiated the wedding, was one of the 20. He gave the name of a children's hospital, not a famous one, and not one in a city you would expect. A specific hospital, in a specific place, for a specific reason, that I know and am not going to print, because it involves a child who is not his. Taylor told me he took 3 days, and that when he called, he did not do a single joke, which she said was the most unsettling phone call of the entire process. She said, "I've known him a long time. He does a joke. That's the whole rhythm of any conversation with him." She said, "He called and said the name, and then said, 'Thanks for asking me,' and hung up." Scott Swift. Taylor's father. He gave the name of an organization that provides financial literacy education in high schools in Pennsylvania. Scott Swift spent his working life in finance. Taylor has talked about it. It is the least surprising selection on the entire list, and I want to explain why it is also, to me, one of the most moving. He told her, "Apparently, I have spent 40 years watching people sign things they did not read." Which is, and I did not notice this until I was writing this out, almost word for word what his daughter said about hers. Two people, 30 years apart, in completely different industries, arriving at the same sentence. Neither of them knew the other's name until July 6th, because of Rule 3. Taylor said she found out and had to go and sit down. Part 11. Travis. My son gave his name in about 11 minutes, which is not the fastest. That is Ed, but is close. He would not tell anybody for months, including his wife, because Rule 5 meant he was not seeing the list, and Rule 3 meant nobody was comparing. I found out on July 6th, like everybody else. It is number 9. It is an organization in Cleveland that runs sports programs for children who cannot afford to be in sports programs. I asked him about it later. I said, "I thought you'd pick something to do with the knee, or the head, or one of the big ones you're already involved with." And Travis said, "I thought about that." He said, "But the thing is, all those places already have me." He said, "I've got things I do. Everybody knows about them, and they're good, and I'm not stopping." He said, "This was supposed to be the one that was actually the thing." Then he said, "Mom, I was 8 years old and I played every sport there was, and I never once thought about what it cost." He said, "I did not think about it. Not one time, not until I was about 26 years old and somebody told me what cleats cost." He said, "You and Dad ate that for 15 years across 2 kids and never said a word about it." And I said, "That's what you do." And he said, "Yeah, if you can." Part 12. Taylor. She was the 20th. She asked 19 people, and then she was the last one, and she took the longest of anybody. which she has admitted, and I found out on July 6th, like everybody else, and then I did not ask her about it for 6 weeks, because I could not work out how to. I asked her on August 14th, at my table, on the day I finally told her about 1974. I said, "Yours is number one on the list." And she said, "That's alphabetical." I said, "I know it's alphabetical." And she said, "I know you know." Hers is an organization that works with young women in music. Not famous, not glamorous. It does something extremely dull and completely essential, which is that it explains contracts to teenagers. That is, functionally, what it does. It sits with young women who have been offered something and it makes sure they understand what they are signing. I did not say anything for a moment when she told me. And then I said, "Taylor." And she said, "Yeah." And I said, "Is this about you?" And she said, "No." Then she said, "It's about the next one." She said, "I got out. It took years and it cost me a great deal, and it was extremely public and I do not want to talk about it." She said, "But I got out." She said, "And I got out because I am who I am. Because I had leverage that almost nobody has." She said, "There is a girl right now, this month, who is 17 years old and who is about to sign something, and she has not got any leverage at all." She said, "And if there is somebody in the room with her who has read it, just somebody who has actually read it and can say, 'Wait, look at that clause,' then she does not have to spend her 30s doing what I did." Then she said, "That's it. That's the whole thing. Somebody in the room who's read it." Part 12 and a half. The one who could not. There were 21 calls. I did not know this until August. Taylor told me at my table on the 14th, near the end of the afternoon, and she told it reluctantly and asked me to be careful with it, and I have been. She asked 21 people. 20 gave a name. One could not. I am not going to say who. It is somebody close to this family. It is not a Kelce, and it is not a Swift, and that is all I am giving you. She called them in early May, same as the rest, and they said, "Can I think about it?" And she said, "Take a week." And a week went by, and then another week, and then it was June. She called them again at the beginning of June, because she had a deadline, and the lawyers needed the final list. And this person said, "I can't do it." And she said, "That's completely fine." And they said, "No, I want to. I've been trying for a month. I can't do it." She told me what they said next, and I have thought about it more than almost anything else in this story. They said, "Every time I sit down to think about it, I get to something I don't want to look at." They said, "And I can't tell if I'm picking the place or the memory." She said, "So I told them to stop." I said, "You told them to stop?" And Taylor said, "Yes," immediately. I said, "Stop. We're done. It's off. Thank you for trying." And I said, "Were you disappointed?" And she said, "No." Then she said, "Donna, I asked 21 people a very invasive question with a lot of money attached to it. 20 of them were able to answer it, and one of them was not, and the one who could not was the one who took it most seriously." She said, "They spent a month with it. 20 of us spent a week." She said, "If anything, they did the most work of anybody on that list." And then she said the thing. She said, "I sent them something else instead." I said, "What?" And she said, "Nothing to do with money. I sent them a note that said, 'You don't have to look at it. It's allowed to stay where it is.'" She said, "I got a reply about 3 weeks later that was one line long, and I am not going to tell you what it said." I want to say something about that, and this is for anybody listening who found themselves getting slightly uncomfortable during the last 20 minutes. Because I know some of you did. I know some of you have been listening to me talk about 6 days of thinking about the most important thing that ever happened to you, and you have been running your own version, and you have got to something you would rather not have got to. There were 21 people asked, and one of them could not do it. That is not a failure. That is the correct response to a genuinely enormous question, and the person who could not answer it is the person who understood it best. You do not have to look at it. It is allowed to stay where it is. Part 13. The night before. There is one more piece. On July 2nd, the night before the wedding, after the rehearsal dinner, late, Taylor gave Travis an envelope. It was the list. Rule 5 said he did not get to see it until it was done, and it was done, and so she gave it to him. He told me about this in August, and he told it badly, in the way he tells things that got to him, with a lot of stopping. He said it was just a page. He said 20 names, alphabetical, no amounts, no explanation, nothing about who picked what. He said just 20 names on a page. He said he read it standing up. And he said he got to about number 6 and had to sit down. I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because I knew them." He said, "I couldn't tell you who picked which one. I still can't, mostly. She never told me, and I've never asked." He said, "But I read down that list, and I knew what about half of them were." He said, "I saw the coaches fund, and I thought, that's Dad. Nobody had to tell me that's Dad." He said, "I saw the speech thing, and I thought, Jason." He said, "And there were about 8 of them I didn't recognize at all, and I sat there thinking, one of these is somebody's whole life, and I have no idea which one." Then he said the thing that I want to end this part on. He said, "Mom, I've been to a lot of weddings." He said, "I've seen the thing where somebody makes a big donation and announces it. I've seen the good version of that, and it's fine." He said, "This was different because I couldn't read it." He said, "I was looking at a page with 20 names on it, and it was the most personal document I have ever held, and I could not decode most of it." He said, "It's a page about 20 people, and none of their names are on it." Part 13 and a half. The room. There is one more thing about that envelope, and it happened about 40 minutes after he opened it. Travis read the list, standing up in a room at the rehearsal dinner on the night of July 2nd, and then sat down, and then read it again. And then he did something that Taylor had not planned for, and did not ask for, and, she says, would probably have talked him out of if he had warned her. He stood up and read it out loud. Not the whole thing, not the names of the 20 people, because he did not know them and could not have. The organizations. He stood up at a rehearsal dinner with 40-some people in the room, most of whom had nothing to do with any of it, and read 20 names off a piece of paper. I was there. I want to describe it. He did not explain what it was first. That was the thing. He just stood up and said, "I want to read something," and then started reading names. And for about the first 4, nobody had any idea what was happening. Then somebody worked it out. I do not know who. Somewhere on the left side of that room, somebody understood that they were listening to a list of the 20 places, and they said something to the person next to them, and it went through that room like weather. And here is the part. There were people in that room who had given names. Not all 20 of them. Some of the 20 were not at the rehearsal dinner, but several were. And each one of them sat in that room and heard their own name read out loud in the middle of a list of 19 others, by a man who did not know which one was theirs. I heard mine. Number 13, the long one with the hyphen. He read it slightly wrong, incidentally. He got a syllable off in the middle. It is not an easy name. And I sat at a table in New York City on the night before my son's wedding and heard him mispronounce the name of a small organization in Ohio that exists because of 2 rooms above a shop in 1974, and he had no idea, and he will never entirely have any idea, and I put my hand flat on the tablecloth and looked at it for about 15 seconds. Ed was next to me. He did not look at me. He put his hand over my hand on the tablecloth, and did not look at me, and did not say anything, and kept looking straight ahead at his son. He heard his own at number 4. Neither of us said one word about any of it, then or for the following 4 days. I asked Travis later why he did it, and he said, "I don't know." I said, "Travis." And he said, "Mom, I genuinely don't know. I read it, and I felt like it shouldn't just be a piece of paper." He said, "It was 20 names, and nobody was ever going to hear them." He said, "So I read them." Taylor told me she watched about 6 people in that room have a reaction she could not explain to anybody sitting near her. She said, "I knew who they were. I was the only person in that room who knew who all of them were." She said, and I had to sit there with a completely normal face and watch 6 people quietly lose it and not be able to look at any of them. Then she said, "That was the hardest 30 seconds of the whole wedding." And I said, "Harder than the ceremony?" And Taylor Swift said, "The ceremony was easy. I knew what was happening in the ceremony." Part 14. What I got wrong. I want to say the thing I got wrong, because I have been getting things wrong all year in these videos, and I have decided that is the honest way to do them. When the donation was announced on July 6th, my first reaction, my genuine first reaction, in a hotel room in New York, 3 days after my son's wedding, was, "That is a very large amount of money, and it is going to look like a press release." I thought that. I want it on the record. I thought, people are going to read $26 million and 20 charities, and they are going to think it is a gesture. They are going to think somebody's team arranged it. And then I remembered that I was one of the 20, and that I had spent 6 days on it, and that I had given a name that came out of 2 rooms above a shop in 1974, and that 18 other people I mostly do not know had done the same thing, alone, in their own houses, with their own 6 days, and that not one single person on this earth was going to know any of that, because Rule 4 meant the organizations would never be told, and Rule 3 meant the 20 of us would never compare. It was designed to be uncreditable. That is the actual design. $26 million arranged so that nobody could be thanked for any of it. Part 15. The letter, again. Which brings me back to the envelope on my counter 9 days ago. A woman who runs a small organization in Ohio wrote to a stranger to say thank you and to ask a question nobody was ever supposed to be able to answer. She wrote, "I have wondered every day since July who it was and why. And the reason I am making this video, the actual reason, and I have thought about it for 9 days, is that there are 19 other organizations with somebody in them wondering the same thing. And there are 19 other people who each gave one name and were promised they would never have to explain it. I am not going to break that for anybody else. The 6 I have given you above, I have permission for, and I asked each of them twice. But I am going to break it for mine. Because I am 73 years old, and I have discovered this year that the things I did not say for 50 years are heavier than the things I said. So, 1974, 2 rooms above a shop, 3 women, 90 minutes and a piece of information. Whoever you were, and you are almost certainly gone, because you were 40 and I was 21, and that was 52 years ago. You are the 13th name on that list. $1.3 million. You never knew my name either. Part 15 and a half. What happened on Thursday? I have to tell you about Thursday, because it happened 2 days ago, and it is the reason this video exists in the form it does. I called Taylor on Wednesday and told her I wanted to tell this. I said, "I want to tell the 20. And she said, "How much of it?" And I said, "Mine, and whatever the others will give me." And there was a long pause. And she said, "You'll have to ask them." I said, "I know." And she said, "All of them, individually. And if one of them says no, that's the end of it for that one." And I said, "I know, Taylor." And she said, "I know you know. I'm saying it anyway because it's the whole thing." So I spent Wednesday and Thursday on the telephone, I am 73 years old and I made 14 phone calls in 2 days, which is more than I made in the previous 2 months. 11 said yes. 6 of those said yes to specifics, and 5 said yes to being mentioned without detail. 3 said no, and I want to say something about those 3. All 3 of them said no in the same way, which was, not because I mind, but because I'd rather not. Which is a distinction I understand completely. The last call I made was to Ed. He was in the garage. He is always in the garage. I went out there and I said, I'm going to tell the thing about 1982, the coaches fund. And Ed said, and I said, is that all right? And he put down whatever he was holding, and he said, are you telling yours? And I said, yes. And he said, 1974? I have not told him. I want to be very clear about that. I have never told Ed Kelce about 2 rooms above a shop. He does not know. He has never known. I told the entire internet about 1988 3 weeks ago, and he found out at the same time as everybody else, and he was fine about it, and we did not discuss it much. He has never known about 1974. So I stood in my own garage on Thursday afternoon, and my husband said, 1974? And I said, how do you know about 1974? And Ed Kelce said, you told me in 1979. I want you to understand that I sat down on a stool in a garage. I said, I did not. And he said, you did. And I said, Ed, I have never told anybody. And my husband said, you told me in 1979. We'd been together about a year. You told me in a car outside your mother's house and you cried, and then you said you didn't want to talk about it again. He said, so we didn't. 47 years. I told that man in a car in 1979 and asked him not to bring it up, and he did not bring it up, for 47 years. Not once, not obliquely, not in an argument, which is when things come out, and Ed and I have had some arguments. He put it down where I asked him to put it, and he left it there for 4.5 decades. I said, why did you never say anything? And Ed said, you asked me not to. I said, that was 1979. And he said, you didn't put a date on it. I sat on that stool for a while. And then I said, did you know about what I picked? And he said, no. I saw the list like everybody else. And I said, did you work it out? And Ed Kelce, 70-something years old, in a garage in Cleveland, Ohio, said, on the 6th of July, when I read number 13, he said, I knew what it was as soon as I saw what they do. And I said, you've known since July. And he said, yeah. And I said, and you didn't say anything. And he said, no. I said, Ed, why not? And my husband said, because you didn't tell me you'd picked it. He said, if you'd wanted me to know, you'd have said. He said, it's the same as 1979. It's not mine to bring up. I want the record to show that I have been married to that man since 1980, and that on Thursday afternoon in a garage, I discovered that he has been quietly holding 2 of my secrets for a combined 94 years, and has never once handled either of them. I said, I'm going to tell all of this, including this bit, including you. And Ed said, fine. And then he picked up whatever he had put down and went back to it. Part 16. For the people listening. I want to ask you to do something, and it will take about 4 minutes. Somewhere in your life there is a 2 rooms above a shop. There is a place, or a person, or a small, unglamorous organization that did something for you at some point that changed what happened next. And you have probably never told anybody about it, because there was never an occasion, because who would you tell? I am not going to ask you to give them money. Most of us have not got $1.3 million, and I include myself in that. Here is what I am going to ask. Say the name out loud to one person this week. That is it. That is the whole ask. Say, there was a place. Here is what it was called, if it had a name. Here is what they did. Because here is what I learned in 6 days in May at 73 years of age. I could not remember the name of the woman who stopped me on that street. I have never known it. I never will. And the reason is that I never once, in 52 years, said any of it out loud to anybody. And things you never say out loud stop having names, and then they stop having faces, and eventually they become a feeling you cannot account for. Do not let it become a feeling you cannot account for. Say the name. I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. In July of 2026, my son and his wife gave away $26 million, and every article in the world reported the number, and not one of them reported that it was 20 people, sitting alone in 20 rooms, being asked the hardest question anybody had ever asked them. 20 people cried. I know that because I was one of them, and because I have now spoken to 6 of the others, and every single one of them said some version of the same thing. Nobody had ever asked before. Thank you for sitting with me today.